The rope bit into her wrists, a rough, insistent truth against the numb cold of her skin. It had rubbed the flesh raw hours ago, but now the pain was just a distant hum, a signal from a body she no longer felt was hers. She was tied to a splintered hitching post in the center of what passed for a town square, a boil of dust and indifference. The sun was a hammer, beating down on her bowed head, baking the mud-caked hem of her dress until it cracked. Her hair, a tangled mat of straw and sorrow, hung over her face, a flimsy curtain against the stairs. She kept her eyes fixed on a single, bleached stone in the dirt at her bare feet. It was smooth and white and perfect, an anchor in the swirling shame. She had a name once, but it felt like a story told about someone else, a ghost word that had no purchase here. Here she was just the woman tied to the post, property that had been lost, found, and was now being disposed of. The townspeople drifted past. A woman with a basket of eggs slowed, her face a mask of pity and disgust, then hurried on. A group of men leaving the saloon laughed, a sound like dry things breaking. One of them spat in her direction, the glob landing in the dust a foot away. A child, no older than 5, stared with wide, unblinking eyes until his mother pulled him away, whispering a sharp warning. Their judgment was a physical thing, another layer of grime on her skin. They were a murmuring, shifting crowd, a wall of faces that saw a problem, not a person. Section then, as the day wore on, even their interest began to fray. She became part of the landscape, no more remarkable than the tired horse trough or the creaking saloon doors. She was an object left out in the sun, waiting. A man had been watching from the shade of the general store's overhang. He had been there for a long time, leaning against a support beam, still as a statue carved from old wood and regret. He wore a long, worn duster the color of the road, and his boots were coated in a fine powder of everywhere and nowhere. His face was a map of hard miles and harder seasons, his eyes set deep in shadow. He carried whole winters in his eyes. He watched the auctioneer, a fleshy man named Garrett with a voice like oiled gravel, try and fail to start a bid. Garrett had won her in a card game 2 nights prior, a victory he'd crowed about until he realized his prize was just another mouth to feed, another burden. He gestured toward her now with a sweep of his arm. Strong back, quiet, look at her, barely used. Silence answered him. A dry wind kicked up a veil of grit. The value of a human soul, it seemed, was less than a sack of flour that day. The man in the duster pushed himself off the beam. His movements were slow, deliberate, each one measured. He did not look at the other men. He did not look at Garrett. His gaze was fixed on her, on the slight, almost imperceptible tremor in her bound hands. He walked into the sun-blasted square. The dust lifted behind him like ghosts rising from his footsteps. He stopped a few feet from Garrett, who puffed up his chest, smelling a sail. The quiet man reached into a pocket inside his duster and pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch. He didn't open it. He just held it in his palm. "I'll take her," he said. His voice was low and rough, as if it had come from under floorboards. It was not a bid. It was a statement. Garrett's eyes darted from the man to the pouch. Greed and relief warred on his face. "For the girl." The man gave a single, curt nod. "Well," Garrett blustered, trying to regain control, "she's worth more than a—" The man tossed the pouch. It landed in the dust between them with a solid, final thud. The sound of it seemed to cut through the afternoon heat. It was the sound of a debt settled, a deal closed. Garrett scrambled to pick it up, his fingers fumbling with the drawstring, his eyes gleaming at the glint of coins inside. He didn't look up again. The quiet man walked to the post. She flinched as his shadow fell over her, her whole body tensing for a blow that did not come. She kept her head down, her world shrunk to the white stone at her feet. He pulled a small, worn pocket knife from his belt. The click of the blade opening was sharp and clear in the sudden stillness. She heard the scrape of steel against hemp once, then twice. The pressure on her wrists vanished. The ropes fell away, leaving angry red welts in their place. Her hands dropped to her sides, heavy and useless. He did not touch her. He stepped back, giving her space, his shadow retreating from her feet. He waited. For a long moment, she did not move. To stand felt like an impossible act of will. But then, slowly, she pushed herself up, her legs trembling like a newborn foal's. She kept her eyes on the ground, afraid of what she might see in his face. Obligation, pity, contempt. He turned and started walking out of the town, his pace slow, measured, expecting her to follow. He did not look back. She hesitated for only a second. Behind her was the post, the dust, the staring eyes. Ahead was a man's back, a straight, unbent line moving toward the horizon. She took a breath that tasted of grit and freedom, and followed. The journey was a long stretch of silence, broken only by the crunch of their boots on the dry earth and the sighing of the wind. He walked ahead, never so far that she felt abandoned, never so close that she felt pursued. It was a strange, unspoken courtesy. The sun began to dip toward the jagged teeth of the western mountains, painting the sky in bruised purples and a slash of blood orange. The heat of the day bled away, leaving a chill that crept into her thin dress. He stopped once. He unslung a canteen from his shoulder and held it out to her, his arm extended fully. She stared at his calloused hand, the knuckles scarred and cracked. It was the first kindness she had been shown in so long. It felt like a trick. Her own hands shook as she reached for it. Her fingers brushed his, a touch as brief and light as a moth's wing. The metal was cool against her lips. The water was lukewarm and tasted of iron, but it was the sweetest thing she had ever known. She drank until her stomach ached, then handed it back. He took it without a word and they walked on. Dusk had settled deep into the hollows of the land by the time they arrived. His home was not a house so much as a suggestion of one, clinging to the side of a low, windswept hill. It was a small cabin of weathered gray wood, its shoulders slumped against the endless sky. A single window stared out like a vacant eye. Beside it, a rickety porch sagged. The whole place looked as if it were holding its breath, waiting for the next hard winter to finally pull it down. A short distance from the cabin, a simple wooden cross stood over a mound of stones, tilted slightly, as if listening to the earth. A profound loneliness radiated from the place, so sharp it was almost a sound. This was a home haunted by an absence. He pushed open the door, which groaned in protest. The inside was one room, dark and smelling of wood smoke, dust, and something else. A faint, lingering scent of lavender and disuse. A stone hearth stood cold against one wall. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs sat in the center. In a corner was a narrow bed, its blanket neatly folded. He gestured toward the table. "Sit." She obeyed, perching on the edge of a chair, her hands clenched in her lap. He moved about the small space with an economy born of long habit. He lit a lantern, and the room bloomed in a soft, yellow light that made the shadows dance. He coaxed a fire to life in the hearth. The crackle of the kindling was the first cheerful sound she had heard all day. He took a loaf of dark bread from a tin box, cut 2 thick slices, and ladled stew from a pot that had been sitting on the cold hearth. He placed a bowl and a slice of bread in front of her. He did the same for himself and sat opposite her. The food steamed between them, a fragile truce. She did not eat. She stared at the bowl, at the chunks of potato and meat swimming in the thick gravy. It was more than she had seen in days. The steam warmed her face. He ate his own meal slowly, his gaze on the fire. He did not rush her. He did not command her to eat. He simply allowed her the space to exist. The silence in the room was different from the silence of the town. This silence was not empty. It was patient. Finally, her stomach betrayed her with a low growl. Her eyes flicked up to his face, but he gave no sign he had heard. She picked up the spoon. The first bite was an agony of want fulfilled. She ate, her movements stiff at first, then more urgent until the bowl was empty. She sopped up the last of the gravy with the bread. When she was done, he stood and took her bowl. He pointed to a pile of clean blankets and a worn, ticking mattress in the far corner, away from his own bed. "That's yours," he said. "The door has no lock." She understood the meaning behind the words. "You are safe. You are not a prisoner." She nodded, a small, jerky movement. She watched him bank the fire for the night, the orange light playing over the hard lines of his face. He blew out the lantern, plunging the room into the flickering gloom of the hearth. He lay down on his own bed, turning his back to her. Soon, the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing filled the small cabin. She lay on her mattress, pulling the coarse wool blankets up to her chin. They smelled of him, of wood smoke and clean earth. For the first time in more nights than she could count, she was warm. She was fed. She was unbound. She listened to the wind howling outside, a lonely, searching sound, and for a moment, she felt the house breathe around her, a slow, sleeping sigh, and in the safety of that breath she slept. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, as stark and dependable as the rising and setting of the sun. They stitched their lives together with the raw thread of shared work, a fabric woven in silence. He would rise before dawn, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards her alarm. She would watch the shadowy shape of him move in the firelight, stoking the embers, putting the coffee pot on to boil. By the time the sky began to pale from black to bruised purple, he would be gone, out to mend the fences that webbed his sparse land or to check his traps. She, in turn, learned the geography of the small cabin. She swept the floor of its perpetual dust, her broom whispering against the wood. She scrubbed the soot from the cooking pots until they shone dully. She learned the particular way the well pump handle groaned and the specific weight of a full bucket of water in each hand. The work was hard, but it was honest. It was a purpose. Her hands, once soft and useless, grew calloused and capable. They rarely spoke. Words seemed like clumsy, unnecessary things in the vast, quiet landscape. Their communication was a language of gestures. He would leave a brace of rabbits on the porch, and she would have a stew simmering by the time he returned, weary and stained with the day's labor. She would find a tear in his shirt, and by morning, it would be mended with small, neat stitches, almost invisible. One afternoon, while gathering firewood near the edge of the property, she came across the grave with the tilting wooden cross. She had seen it from a distance but had never dared approach. Now, drawn by some impulse, she knelt beside the mound of stones. Weeds grew thick around the base. She began to pull them, her fingers gentle, clearing the space until the earth was bare and dark. A patch of stubborn wild daisies grew nearby. She picked one, its face a simple, honest white, and laid it at the foot of the cross. She did not know who was buried there, but she knew what loss felt like. When he returned that evening, he said nothing, but she saw his gaze linger on the single white flower, a star against the dark stones. The next day, a cold wind turned mean, rattling the window pane and promising an early frost. She shivered as she drew water from the well, her dress offering little protection. When she came back inside, a heavy wool shawl was lying on her mattress. It was old and smelled of cedar, but it was thick and warm. He was sitting at the table, sharpening his knife, and didn't look up as she wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth of it felt like a shield. Sometimes she would hum. It was an old habit, a tuneless, wordless sound that came from a place before the rope and the post. The first time she did it, she caught herself and fell silent, her heart hammering. But he had only paused in his carving of a bit of wood, his hands still for a moment, before resuming his work. After that, she did not stop herself. The low, quiet sound was her own, a small reclamation of voice. The world outside their small patch of land rarely intruded. But one day, a neighbor, a lean man with curious eyes, rode up to the fence line while Elias, she had learned his name from a faded inscription on a book, was splitting logs. She watched from the window as the neighbor gestured toward the cabin, his meaning clear. Elias stopped his work. He rested the axe head on the chopping block and simply stood there, a solid, unmovable presence between the neighbor and the house. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. But after a few moments of that silent, granite stillness, the neighbor tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode away. Elias watched him go before picking up the axe and splitting a log in two with a single, clean blow. The trust between them was a fragile plant, growing in the thin soil of their shared solitude. But it was growing. One night, the past came for her in her sleep. She was back at the post, the rope tightening, the faces laughing. Garrett's voice, slick and cruel, whispered in her ear. She cried out, a raw, terrified sound, and woke up thrashing. The blankets tangled around her like snares. The room was dark save for the faint orange glow of the embers in the hearth. A large shadow fell over her. Elias was standing there, a silhouette against the fire. She scrambled back, pressing herself against the cold wall. "Please," she whispered, the words ragged. "Don't lock me in." He did not move closer. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, a rock in the swirling waters of her fear. "I told you. No locks on my doors." He stood there for a long moment, a silent guardian, until her breathing slowed and the trembling in her limbs subsided. He went back to the hearth and added a small log to the embers. The fire brightened, chasing the worst of the shadows from her corner. He sat in his chair, not on his bed, and kept watch. She pulled the wool shawl tight around her. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you take me?" He stared into the flames, his face etched in light and shadow. The firelight found the deep lines around his eyes. "I had a wife," he said, his voice rough with disuse, with memory. "Her name was Mary. The fever took her last spring." He pointed with his chin toward the grave outside. "She was a kind woman. She would not have left you at that post." He said nothing more. He didn't need to. In his words, she understood everything. He hadn't bought a servant. He hadn't rescued a victim out of some grand sense of heroism. He had performed an act of decency in the name of a memory. He was honoring the ghost of a kind woman. "And my son," he added, his voice cracking on the last word. "He went with her." She looked at the man, this stranger who had given her shelter, and for the first time, she saw not just a protector, but a man as broken as she was. He carried his own ghosts. They sat there in the shared silence, two solitary souls warming themselves by the same small fire, and the fragile plant of trust sent down a deep and certain root. The peace they had built was as thin as new ice over deep water. They both knew it couldn't last. The harbinger of its breaking came not as a letter or a single rider, but as a smudge of dust on the far horizon, a sign of several horses moving fast. Elias saw it first. He was on the roof, replacing a loose shingle when his body went rigid. He stared east, his hand shading his eyes against the morning sun. She was hanging laundry on a line she had strung between the cabin and a lone pine, and she saw the stillness in him. It was the same stillness he'd had when the neighbor came to the fence line, but this was sharper, harder, dangerous. She followed his gaze and saw it too. The dust cloud grew, resolving itself into three figures on horseback. They were not moving with the easy gait of travelers. They were riding with purpose, and their purpose was this hill, this cabin. Her blood ran cold. The wet sheet she was holding slipped from her fingers and fell to the dirt. She knew, with a certainty that was a cold knot in her gut, who was coming. Elias climbed down from the roof, his movements swift and sure. He didn't run. His face was grim, a mask of stone. He met her eyes, and in their depths she saw a storm gathering. "Go inside," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She shook her head, a small, defiant motion. She would not hide. Not this time. A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps respect, crossed his face before it hardened again. "Stay behind me, then." He walked to the edge of the porch and waited, his feet planted wide, his hands loose at his sides. He was not armed, but he looked as immovable as the hill itself. She stood in the doorway behind him, her hand gripping the rough wood of the frame until her knuckles turned white. The wind whipped strands of hair across her face, but she didn't brush them away. She watched the riders close the distance. The man in the lead was Garrett. He rode with an arrogant slump in the saddle, his fleshy face red from the effort. The two men with him were hired muscle, their faces blank and mean. They pulled their horses to a halt just beyond the dead nettle that passed for a yard, kicking up a cloud of dust that tasted of invasion. Garrett smirked, his gaze sliding past Elias to fix on her in the doorway. Well, well, look what we have here. Playing house, are we? He spat on the ground. I've come for my property. Elias didn't move. His voice was level, deceptively calm. She's not your property, Garrett. I have a receipt, Garrett sneered, patting his coat pocket. Paid you for her keep, did I? Or did you just steal her off? Either way, she belongs to me. A deal's a deal. Now send her out. The only deal was for her freedom, Elias said, his voice dropping lower, colder. You took the coin. The transaction is done. She stays here. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. The wind died down. The only sound was the impatient stamping of a horse. This was their land, their sanctuary, and it had become a battleground. Garrett's face purpled with rage. You think you can just take what's mine? That little piece of trash? I won her fair and square. She's mine to do with as I please. He began to dismount, his intentions clear. One of his men reached for the rifle in his saddle scabbard. I'm telling you for the last time, Elias said, and now his voice had an edge like sharpened steel. Ride away. But Garrett was consumed by his own righteous greed. Get out of my way, old man, before I have you moved. It happened fast. As Garrett took a step forward, Elias moved to meet him. He was not a young man, but he moved with a woodsman's strength, a solid wall of principle and fury. He simply stood in Garrett's path, a silent, unyielding declaration. And then, another sound cut the air, the click of a rifle hammer being pulled back. But it wasn't one of Garrett's men. Everyone froze. All eyes turned to the porch. She stood there, no longer cowering in the doorway. In her hands, she held Elias's heavy hunting rifle. She had slipped back inside while they were talking, her movements swift and silent. She held it steady, the stock braced against her shoulder. The long barrel pointed not at Garrett's heart, but at the ground just in front of his feet. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a fire no one had ever seen there before. No, she said. Her voice was thin from disuse, but it was clear and hard as flint. It was the first word she had spoken to him, to any of them. It was a complete sentence. Garrett stared at her, his mouth agape. He saw not the cowering, silent object he had tied to a post, but a woman holding a rifle, her gaze unwavering. He saw someone who was no longer his to claim. His bravado, built on the assumption of her powerlessness, crumbled. He looked from her to the grim, resolute face of Elias, then to his two hired men, who suddenly seemed much less interested in a fight. They had been paid to intimidate a broken woman and an old farmer, not to get into a shooting war over them. Elias never took his eyes off Garrett. He saw the flicker of cowardice, the sudden calculation of risk. He didn't press the advantage. He didn't threaten further. He just waited. The unified, unyielding front of the two of them, the man a rock, the woman a flame, was more potent than any weapon. Garrett licked his dry lips. He took a clumsy step backward, his boots shuffling in the dirt. He tried to muster one last sneer, but it came out as a pathetic grimace. She ain't worth the trouble, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He turned, heaved himself back onto his horse, and without another word, wrenched the reins and galloped away. His men, looking relieved, wheeled their own mounts and followed, leaving nothing behind but the settling dust and a profound, ringing silence. Elias stood watching them go, his body still tense, until they were just a smudge on the horizon again. He turned slowly. She was still holding the rifle, though her arms had begun to tremble from the weight of it. Her gaze was fixed on him, wide and questioning. He walked onto the porch and gently took the rifle from her hands. His fingers brushed hers. He leaned the gun against the wall. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the strength that had been forged in the fire of her past, the resilience that had allowed her to stand her ground. He saw the woman she was becoming. "You didn't run," he said, his voice soft. "You didn't either," she whispered back. A faint, tired smile touched the corners of his mouth. "I was scared," she admitted, the confession a fragile offering. "I know," he said, and in those two words, she heard everything. "I was scared too. I am proud of you. We are safe now." A shared look passed between them, an affirmation deeper than any vow. The threat was gone. The sanctuary had held. In the quiet aftermath, something had irrevocably shifted. The space between them, once filled with silence and caution, was now charged with a new, unspoken understanding. The house no longer felt haunted by absence. It felt protected by presence. Their presence. That evening, as he mended the section of fence Garrett's horses had trampled, she came out and stood nearby, holding the wool shawl close around her. The sun was setting, casting long, peaceful shadows across the land. The world felt scrubbed clean. He finished tightening a wire and stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers. He looked at her, at the way the fading light caught in her hair, turning it from straw to old gold. She was thin as a fence rail, and she carried her scars where no one could see them, but she stood tall. "I don't have a name for you," he said, the words coming out rough as if hewn from wood. It wasn't a question. It was an admission, an apology. He had called her or the woman he had thought of her as a duty, a ghost's last wish. He had not let himself see her as a person. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him, her gaze direct. "My father called me Lena," she said softly. It felt strange to say the name aloud, like trying on a dress she had not worn in years. Elias nodded slowly, testing the sound of it. "Lena," he repeated. It fit. It was a good, strong name. It's a good name. By giving him her name, she had given him a piece of her past. By accepting it, he had offered her a place in his future. It was a contract more binding than any piece of paper, a promise whispered to the rising moon. From that day on, she was no longer the woman from the post. She was Lena. The act of naming was a rebirth. The act of rebuilding the fence was a ritual. They worked together, she holding the post steady while he tamped the earth around them, their movements falling into an easy, synchronized rhythm. They were rebuilding the borders of their life, not just with wood and wire, but with shared effort and mutual respect. They were claiming this small piece of earth as their own, together. One day, months later, as the first snowflakes of winter began to drift down from a sky the color of slate, Lena was by the hearth, hanging a small, brightly colored bird she had carved from a piece of scrap wood. It was a clumsy thing, but it was cheerful. She hung it from a nail on the dark wooden mantelpiece. It was the first bit of adornment the cabin had ever known, the first thing that wasn't purely for survival. Elias came in, shaking the snow from his coat, and stopped when he saw it. He looked at the little wooden bird, then at the cross-stitch sampler of Mary's that still hung on the far wall, then back to the bird. His face was unreadable. Lena's heart faltered. Perhaps she had overstepped. But then he walked to the fire, warming his chapped hands, and a small, quiet smile touched his lips. "It needed a bit of color," he said. The house, which had been a shell of memories, a monument to what was lost, was breathing again. It was becoming a home. The final image of their story isn't one of grand declarations or passionate embraces. It is a quiet one. It is the two of them sitting on the repaired porch steps as winter deepens, wrapped in blankets, sharing a mug of hot coffee. The snow falls softly around them, blanketing the world in a pristine, peaceful white. It covers the scarred earth and the lonely grave, making everything new. They don't speak. They don't need to. They watch the snow fall, and in the comfortable silence, there is the feeling of a future, stretching out before them, quiet and steady and full of the profound, simple grace of a life reclaimed from the ashes. This story, it isn't just about a man rescuing a woman. It's about two people, broken in their own ways, who find themselves standing on the same patch of lonely ground. It's about the quiet courage it takes to build a sanctuary, not with high walls and locked gates, but with small kindnesses and unspoken promises. It is the story of how a person can be unnamed by the world, discarded like so much refuse, and then find, in the care of another wounded soul, the strength to name themselves again. We all have a post we've been tied to in one way or another, a place of shame, of fear, of being defined by our lowest moment. And we all hope for that quiet figure to walk out of the shadows, not to save us with grand heroics, but to simply cut the ropes and offer us a drink of water, to give us the space to stand on our own 2 feet. So here's your naming. Think of the person who saw you when you felt invisible, the one who offered you the shawl when the wind turned mean, the one who stood between you and the thing you feared most, and did not flinch. Their love wasn't loud. It was a mended shirt, a bowl of hot stew on a cold night, the steady presence that said, without words, I am here, because fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is accept the kindness offered. And if you're brave enough to do that, you might just find that the person rebuilding the fence beside you isn't just mending a boundary. They're building a home right there with you,